On the night of March 17th, Iranian ballistic missiles struck the Ras Tanura oil refinery complex in Saudi Arabia. This is not just another refinery. Ras Tanura processes more than 5 million barrels of crude oil every single day. That is roughly 6% of global oil supply running through a single industrial complex on the coast of the Persian Gulf. The facility includes massive storage tanks holding tens of millions of barrels, a marine terminal where supertankers load Saudi crude for export to Asia, Europe, and North America, and a petrochemical plant producing raw materials for plastics, fertilizers, and industrial chemicals used across the global economy. When those missiles hit, they did not just damage infrastructure. They struck the oil heart of the global system. And the damage is forcing every government, every corporation, and every consumer on Earth to confront a reality they have been avoiding for decades. The world's energy security is built on a foundation that can be destroyed in minutes. The IRGC announced the strike within an hour of impact. The statement described the attack as retaliation for American and Israeli military operations inside Iran, and explicitly warned that any facility supporting hostile forces in the region would be considered a legitimate target. That phrase, any facility, is the critical escalation. Because Ras Tanura is not an American base. It is not an Israeli installation. It is a Saudi refinery that processes oil sold to customers all over the world, including China, India, Japan, and South Korea. Iran just declared that the entire energy infrastructure of the Gulf is now part of the battlefield, and if that infrastructure is fair game, then the global economy is operating inside a war zone. Saudi authorities confirmed the strike, but downplayed the damage in their initial statements. The Ministry of Energy announced that a limited number of storage tanks had been hit, that firefighting teams had contained the blaze, and that refinery operations would resume within 72 hours. But satellite imagery analyzed by independent energy analysts tells a very different story. At least 9 large crude storage tanks were destroyed or severely damaged. The marine terminal sustained direct hits that disabled 2 of the 4 loading berths, where tankers docked to take on cargo. And the refinery's main distillation unit, the core processing facility that separates crude oil into gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and other products, was offline as of March 19th, with no confirmed timeline for restart. If Saudi Arabia cannot restore Ras Tanura to full operation within a week, global oil markets will enter a supply crisis unlike anything seen in decades. Oil prices responded immediately. Brent crude, the international benchmark, surged from $108 per barrel to $143 within 12 hours of the strike. That is a 32% single-day increase, the largest price shock since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. West Texas Intermediate, the American benchmark, hit $139. Gasoline futures in New York spiked by 40 cents per gallon overnight. And those price increases have not yet reached consumers at the pump because the physical supply disruptions are still working their way through the distribution system. Within 72 hours, drivers in the United States, Europe, and Asia will see fuel costs jump by amounts that have not been experienced outside of wartime emergencies. The broader economic implications are catastrophic. Airlines are suspending routes because jet fuel costs make many flights economically unviable. Major carriers have announced emergency schedule reductions, affecting thousands of daily flights. Shipping companies are imposing emergency fuel surcharges that will push up the cost of every imported good from electronics to clothing to food. Manufacturers dependent on petrochemical feedstocks are halting production lines because the inputs they need are either unavailable or priced beyond affordability. Chemical plants, plastics manufacturers, and fertilizer producers are shutting down operations across multiple continents. And inflation, which central banks spent the last 3 years trying to control through aggressive interest rate increases, is about to reignite with a force that monetary policy cannot contain. Because this is not a demand-side inflation problem that higher interest rates can solve. This is a supply destruction event. The oil that powers the global economy is being removed from the market by military force, and no amount of financial engineering will replace barrels that no longer exist. The strategic calculation behind Iran's decision to strike Ras Tanura is more sophisticated than most analysts anticipated. Tehran has spent weeks absorbing American and Israeli strikes on its territory, losing military commanders, weapons facilities, and strategic infrastructure. The expectation in Washington and Jerusalem was that Iran would eventually exhaust its ability to retaliate, or that domestic pressure would force the regime to accept a negotiated de-escalation. Instead, Iran escalated in a way that changes the entire structure of the conflict. By targeting Gulf energy infrastructure rather than American military bases, Iran has shifted the burden of the war onto the global economy. Every country that depends on Gulf oil, and that includes most of the developed and developing world, now has a direct stake in whether this conflict continues. And the political pressure on Washington to end the crisis, rather than intensify it, just increased by an order of magnitude. China released a statement within hours of the strike. Beijing condemned the attack, but also called for an immediate ceasefire and a return to diplomatic negotiations. The statement emphasized that all parties must exercise restraint and that actions threatening global energy security are unacceptable. That language is carefully calibrated. China is not defending Iran's right to strike refineries, but it is also not endorsing American military operations that provoked the retaliation. What Beijing is doing is signaling that if the United States chooses to respond to the Ras Tanura strike with further attacks on Iran, China will not remain neutral. And given that China is the world's largest oil importer and that its economy depends on stable energy supplies from the Gulf, Beijing's position carries weight that cannot be ignored. Russia's response has been more direct. Moscow released a statement describing the strike as a predictable consequence of Western military aggression in the Middle East, and warning that further escalation could destabilize the entire region, with consequences that extend far beyond the immediate conflict zone. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov stated explicitly that Iran has a legitimate right to defend itself and that any attempt to use the Ras Tanura strike as a pretext for expanding military operations would be met with strong opposition from Russia. That is not empty rhetoric. Russia has naval assets in the eastern Mediterranean, air defense systems deployed in Syria, and intelligence sharing agreements with Iran that give Moscow significant visibility into American and Israeli military planning. If Washington decides to launch a major strike package against Iranian energy or military infrastructure, Russia will know about it in advance. And Russia will have options for complicating that operation in ways that increase the risks and reduce the probability of success. Inside the United States, the political debate is rapidly polarizing. Hawks in Congress and the defense establishment are calling for immediate retaliation against Iranian energy infrastructure. The argument is straightforward. If Iran can strike refineries with impunity, then deterrence has failed. And if deterrence has failed, then the only way to restore it is to demonstrate that attacks on energy infrastructure will result in the destruction of Iran's own oil production and export capacity. The proposed targets include the Karg Island oil terminal, which handles 90% of Iran's crude exports, the Abadan refinery, one of the largest in the Middle East, and offshore oil platforms in the Persian Gulf that Iran depends on for revenue. Destroy those facilities, the argument goes, and Iran loses the economic foundation that funds its military and sustains the regime. The opposing view, held by a smaller but increasingly vocal group of analysts and policymakers, is that striking Iranian energy infrastructure would trigger a regional catastrophe that the United States is not prepared to manage. If America destroys Karg Island, Iran will close the Strait of Hormuz. If the strait closes, 20% of global oil supply stops moving. If that supply stops, oil hits $200 per barrel, gasoline in the United States exceeds $6 per gallon, and the global economy enters a recession that makes 2008 look mild. And even if the United States is willing to accept those costs, there is no guarantee that destroying Iranian oil facilities ends the conflict. Iran has spent decades preparing for exactly this scenario. It has dispersed its military assets, hardened its critical infrastructure, and built relationships with proxy forces across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen that can sustain operations even if the central government is under severe pressure. The Gulf states are caught in an impossible position. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and Oman all host American military assets and depend on American security guarantees. But they also sit within range of Iranian missiles and drones, and their energy infrastructure, the foundation of their economies, is completely exposed. If the conflict escalates, and if Iran begins systematically targeting Gulf refineries, export terminals, and petrochemical plants, the economic damage will be catastrophic and immediate. And unlike the United States, which has domestic oil production and strategic reserves, the Gulf states have no backup. Their entire economic model, oil exports funding government budgets and financing economic development, collapses if the export infrastructure is destroyed. The Ras Tanura strike has forced Gulf governments to ask a question they have avoided for years. Is the American security guarantee worth the risk of becoming a permanent battlefield in a conflict between Washington and Tehran? And if the answer is no, what alternatives exist? China has been offering an answer for the better part of a decade. Beijing provides investment, infrastructure development, and market access without military entanglements. The Gulf states have been reluctant to fully embrace that model because they still value the deterrent effect of American military power. But if that deterrent effect is producing the opposite of security, if it is turning the Gulf into a war zone, then the calculation changes. Insurance premiums for tankers transiting the Persian Gulf have increased by more than 600% since the Ras Tanura strike. Some underwriters are refusing to insure Gulf voyages altogether, regardless of price. That means ships are either refusing to enter the Gulf or demanding payment terms that make the economics of oil transport prohibitively expensive. And if ships stop moving, the oil sitting in storage tanks at refineries and export terminals has no way to reach customers. The supply chain does not just slow down, it stops. And when it stops, the global economy stops with it. Energy analysts are now modeling scenarios that were considered extreme hypotheticals just weeks ago. If 3 more major refineries or export terminals in the Gulf are struck and disabled, global oil supply drops by 12 to 15 million barrels per day. That is roughly 12% of total world consumption disappearing from the market. There is no spare capacity anywhere in the world that can replace that volume. Strategic petroleum reserves in the United States, Europe, China, and Japan combined hold enough oil to cover the shortfall for perhaps 90 days if rationing and demand destruction measures are implemented immediately. After that, the reserves are exhausted, and if the conflict has not ended by then, the world enters uncharted territory. Fuel shortages, transport disruptions, food supply chain failures, industrial shutdowns, and political instability in every country where populations can no longer afford or access the energy they need to function. The next 72 hours are critical. The United States is deciding whether to retaliate for the Ras Tanura strike. Iran is preparing for that retaliation and planning its next move. The Gulf states are calculating whether their alignment with Washington is sustainable. China and Russia are positioning themselves to exploit any fracture in the Western coalition. And global markets are pricing in the possibility that this escalates into a full-scale energy war with no exit strategy and no mechanism for de-escalation. What makes this moment different from every previous oil crisis is that the actors involved are not negotiating over price or market share. They are fighting over geopolitical dominance, regional security structures, and the future distribution of power in a system that is being reshaped by force. In 1973, the oil embargo ended because the parties involved reached a political settlement. In 2008, prices spiked because of financial speculation and temporary demand surges, but the physical infrastructure remained intact and supply eventually normalized. This time, the infrastructure itself is being destroyed, and the actors destroying it believe that the costs of restraint are higher than the costs of war. The Ras Tanura strike is not the end of the escalation. It is the beginning of a phase where critical infrastructure, the refineries, pipelines, storage facilities, and export terminals that the global economy depends on becomes the primary target. And once that phase begins, the feedback loops become extremely difficult to control. Higher oil prices fund Iranian military operations. Strikes on Iranian facilities provoke retaliation against Gulf infrastructure. Each retaliatory strike removes more supply from the market, driving prices higher, increasing the economic pressure on governments to end the conflict, but also increasing the political pressure to demonstrate strength and restore deterrence through military action. And in that loop, rationality does not guarantee de-escalation. It can just as easily produce a spiral where every actor believes they are making the only defensible choice, given the constraints they face, and the cumulative result is catastrophe. The oil heart of America and of the world is in the Gulf, and it is now beating inside a war zone. Every barrel of oil that powers vehicles, heats homes, generates electricity, and feeds industrial processes came from infrastructure that is within range of weapons that have already been used. The assumption that energy security could be taken for granted, that the systems built over decades to extract, refine, and distribute oil would continue functioning regardless of geopolitical turbulence, has been shattered. And the world is waking up to the realization that the global economy runs on a foundation that can be destroyed faster than it can be rebuilt.